Hi there, I'm Betsy Datiri. I just want to spend a few minutes trying to help you with children in your world that might be going through grief. You might be a class teacher with children who have experienced loss in your class. You could be a family or a family friend of somebody, some child or young person who's experienced some tragic loss. And I just want to run through in this little video a few areas and experiences and feelings that children often go through when they're trying to process that loss. Loss is not something people just get over quickly. We can't just adjust to our daily life. What actually happens is children and young people have to go through various different experiences in order to get to the other end. What does the other end look like? My hope would be that children, after maybe 6 months, if it's not a significant loss, or after a year or two, if it's a really significant loss, what we'd really love is for children to be able to process the grief in a way that means that they've actually felt feelings, they've actually communicated sadness, they've actually had their emotions validated by several adults in a way that the grief doesn't sit there like a big lump stuck on the inside until they're much, much older, where they just carry this lump, this massive concrete lump around with them that causes them more trauma symptoms. I'd rather that people were able in their childhood and in their youth to process these emotional experiences, these experiences connected with loss and grief in a way that actually means they're familiar with it as they get older. And then if another loss happens in adulthood, they know what it's going to look like. And they have some skills and tools embedded that means that they don't go back into long-term psychological shock, but they're able to again process the loss that comes with being a human alive. So I hope this helps. It's just a little overview, but it gives enough, I hope, of a roadmap into what grief looks like. So the first thing is shock. Even if the loss or the death was expected, very, very often, almost always, children and adults go into shock. Adults might look like they're in shock, or they might feel like they have to carry on. And particularly with funerals and parties and memories and packing houses away, there's so much activity to be focused on that often the adult is absorbed in that while they're in shock for quite some time before suddenly they feel the shock. Children can go in and out of shock. What does that look like? It means sometimes they'll reach out, or they'll want a phone, or they'll want a hug from the person that they've lost. That person that's passed away, they will one moment be so aware that they're gone. And then the next minute, they'll just naturally reach out for them. And that can cause them a feeling of shock. It's like being slapped in the face again with the realization of the pain of death. And so when we recognize that shock is a psychological thing that comes with physiological impact, it can feel like a punch in the stomach. It can feel like your breath is suddenly becoming shallow because you gasp for air when you realize yet again that that person is no longer there. It can feel like it's the first time you've heard that news. So when we understand shock and we can explain it to children, they're less frightened by it. Very often children become anxious about anxiety or shocked about shock. So this psychoeducation just enables children to feel more empowered and less terrified by the different feelings that they're feeling in their body or their emotions or their mind. So one, shock. Shock can come and go for a year. It can be entirely normal. There's nothing wrong with a child that still says, oh, I'm just going to go and they want to cuddle, reach out, write a letter, save some special food, or text a relative that's maybe passed away. Don't worry, that's normal. But how we handle those moments is an opportunity for the child to be held, and what we use the word contained in that grief, rather than feeling that feeling of sadness and then pushing it away and pretending they're okay. Being able to create an environment where they can feel that sadness, where tears are expected and welcomed, but if there's no tears, there's no pressure either. Just that environment where, oh, that hurts, doesn't it? think that hurts me too. Maybe we should just sit with that for a second. Oh, I miss that person. Sometimes it feels really hard, doesn't it? Being able to put language around it helps the child then have language, because we need to teach them. It can feel strange to children to have everybody else carrying on. It can feel strange, particularly if a child has lost a very close relative. It can feel very strange to them to see a child shouting at that relative. You know, if they've lost their mum, it can be strange for them to see a child shouting at their mum. And inside they're feeling, oh, you've no idea. You're so lucky to have a mum. But they rarely put that into words. Instead, what you might see is suddenly a temper tantrum, and you don't know where it's come from. But it could come from the fact that they've just seen a child being angry with their mum. And actually, that's so frustrating for them, because they'd love to be angry with their mum again, but they've lost their mum or their uncle or their aunt or their dad or their grandpa, whoever it is. And so shock causes the person to feel quite like in a daze. Like, why don't they understand that not everyone has a mum? Why? But yet the other part of them is just looking completely normal, and they're carrying on life totally normally. And somebody on the outside might not even know that they've gone through such a tragedy. That's shock. Sadness, of course, is a reality, but we're living in a society that very often tries to say that if you're feeling sad, you're probably depressed, you've probably got some clinical disorder. And actually, we need to welcome back that feeling of sadness. What is sadness? Sadness is when you do feel that weight. It's a weight, it's like a blanket on you of heaviness. That heaviness is entirely appropriate, and it mustn't be pushed down on the inside, but again, it needs to be welcomed into a space where people can use language to say, I just feel weighed down, I feel heavy, I feel sad, I feel so deeply sad. It's deep, deep down. When people can begin to use words, when we can invite children to use those words, it helps them. When we externalize that which is going on in the inside, we feel better. That's the very premise of therapy. It's the ability to externalize that which is invisible and validate it. It's hard to have validated things that are invisible with no words attached. And it's really hard to express what's going on when you're a child and you don't have words. You don't know if there's something wrong with you if you feel this big pain. Often children have tummy aches, and tummy aches can be anxiety or sadness. And they just think maybe they're ill, maybe they're going to die too. So it's important that we recognize that we call those somatic symptoms, body symptoms that come with sadness, that come with grief, that come with anxiety. And when we're able to use words to explain that, it reduces the panic around it. How can we create environments where people are welcome to be sad? We don't rush them, we don't panic them, we don't say, haven't you done that enough? Isn't it time to move on? Why don't we think about some positive things? Sit with them in the sadness. We can't fix it, but let's be with them just for a moment and feel that sadness. Hold it for a moment. Breathe through it. And as we do that, we are being with them. They feel held in the sadness, rather than us essentially non-verbally saying, I can't do it either. I can't do it either. If I think about it, it's going to overwhelm me. I can't do it. Let's not stay there. Let's not think about that. That's not going to help grief be processed and can lead to lots of long-term challenges. Anxiety, the world seems to be more understanding of anxiety now, and anxiety is that feeling of worry and panic. But sometimes children and young people don't feel it in their mind. They can't put it into words. They can't say why they're worried or anxious. They instead just feel it as an awareness of their heart beating faster, or a shallowness of breath, or that can cause them to feel dizzy, or they just feel a bit faint, or they feel like they've got too much energy that they don't know what to get. They don't know how to get rid of it. They're just so full of energy, or they're just muddled on the inside. And anxiety can lead them to need additional reassurance. You might feel like the child has regressed in age, but actually they're just needing more reassurance. When will you be picking me up? Who will be picking me up? What car will you be in? What time exactly? What will be happening at that time? Will you definitely have the food that I need with me? Have you remembered that phone call? They often need more reassurance of the details of life are being taken care of by the adults around them, because they feel like any one tiny thing that goes wrong could trigger them into a feeling of despair again. So they're clinging on to try and have normality in their everyday life while their body and their mind and their subconscious are processing grief. They might need reassurance about all sorts of small things. And if a small thing doesn't go well, so if you've got the wrong flavour crisps, if you've got the wrong snack at lunchtime or whatever, the child can have a huge meltdown, because it can feel like, you didn't listen to me, you didn't hear me, you didn't recognise that need. And that can feel like the foundation on which they're standing feels rocky. It feels like that tiny detail, which in your world could be like, really, that was so small, I'll get it right next time. But to the child who's clinging on to all these feelings of grief and loss, it can be the final straw. It can cause what we would call a disproportionate reaction to a minor challenge. And I always use the illustration that if a child stubs their toe when they're on holiday, if any of us do, actually, we often go, oh, silly door, ow, that hurt, because we're just desperate to go out to the sun or go out and enjoy our holiday. But if we stub our toe when we're having a really bad day anyway, we might have a disproportionate reaction to the stubbing of our toe. And that's not because of the stubbing of our toe, it's because that's the final straw. So it might be all like, I can't do this anymore, it's all too much, I'm going to resign. As adults, or children might go, it's too much, I can't do it anymore, I'm never going back to school, or I'm never going back to that club. And when we recognize that those small little things can be a trigger to express some emotions that are held on the inside, rather than saying, well, that's a ridiculous reaction to having the wrong snack. Don't be so ridiculous. Instead, we can see it as an opportunity to bring comfort and soothing and co-regulation to the child, who is actually just needing that adult reassurance that they're there, that that adult is still strong. No matter what's happened, they still have got an adult that will look after them. Even if you're the TA or the teacher or the parent or the aunt or the uncle or whoever you are, they're looking to your face to say, are you going to be okay? Are you strong enough to help me through this? Because I'm little, and I might even look big, but I'm little on the inside, and I need adults around me to help me. So anxiety is very much a factor that can either get bigger in grief, or it can arrive in grief for the first time. Of course, that can lead, all these feelings can lead to a child or a young person feeling overwhelmed. It can just all feel too much. They're feeling these feelings like tummy ache in their tummy. They're sometimes feeling they're catching breath. They suddenly find that they're looking at somebody else with their relative and feeling all angry and frustrated and sad and injustice. And it's so many feelings that are suddenly there. They're even finding that their behavior is less predictable as they suddenly cry, or they suddenly get cross, or they suddenly have a disproportionate reaction to a minor challenge. So they're struggling with their own behavior, and they're thinking, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And I've lost my, whoever it is, I've lost that relative, friend. I don't, what's wrong with me? Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm sick. Maybe I'm, and they can panic. So we need to, again, just recognize that when somebody is overwhelmed, their buckets are full. We need to help them empty their buckets. We as the adults might feel like we've got way fuller buckets than them. But actually, as adults, I'm afraid we have to make space for our children to empty their buckets on us. And we need to find some time instead to empty our buckets somewhere else. And that's why I always recommend, if adults that are going through grief, with children going through grief, if adults can get that additional support from a group, a grief group, if they can get additional support from extra friends having coffee or a therapist, that will enable them to empty their buckets somewhere else, so they're more able to be a container of the muddy buckets of the children. Sometimes children end up being very, very clingy. They can end up feeling very panicky about losing other things like their cuddly toy or losing a place in a football team, because loss is loss. And when they've lost somebody, it can lead to them feeling nervous about losing anything else. when it comes to the loss of the person that they care for and that they love, very often they kind of oscillate between wanting to process and talk obsessively about the person they lost and look for memories like photographs and presents that they've been given, and then the next minute don't want to mention it, don't want to talk about it, no, shush, stop it. And they do need to have a sense of power over that because they feel powerless in the sense of the loss. So they need to have some power in when and where they feel able to process and talk about their loved one. Very often they need some tangible memories. And that's why we make memory boxes, and we make memory boxes usually with just normal shoe boxes that the children decorate and paint and put stickers on, or older children might have little wooden, just very plain, light brown wooden boxes that maybe has something precious to them on the outside or their name written on the outside, but on the inside carries important memories of the loved one that they're missing. Any kind of memories, from photographs to letters that were written to maybe something that their loved one that they've lost gave them, like a soft toy or a little piece of a piece of clothing that they were given. And that memory box is often not just a box that contains things that remind them of the person, also it's a box that is kind of symbolic of a space in their bedroom or a space in your sitting room where they're able to go to. And it's a visual reminder of, I need to spend time thinking about this person. And so you as the adult, if you're living with them, can see that if they've gone to that box, then they're needing a little bit of space and time and maybe a bit of comfort and soothing. It's another non-visual way of saying, do you need a hot chocolate? Do you need me to sit with you? Or do you need some space? And when we're able to use those words to react to that symbol of them being near their memory box, then we're able to actually help them process their grief. But we can't force them, we can't rush them, we can't hope that the longer they spend there, the quicker they'll get over it. Life is just not like that. Loss and grief just take time. Of course, anger is a very real and valid emotion when somebody's lost somebody, particularly, of course, when they've lost somebody when it's an inappropriate time. And sad though this is to say, we recognize that old age does come with loss. But actually, when somebody has had what we would call a traumatic grief, so they've lost somebody young or somebody that really it was far too early for them to pass away, then that sense of injustice does lead to anger, and that anger is appropriate. So the anger, the feeling is appropriate. We need to help them with the behavior. How can we help them express that anger in a way that means they're not constantly on edge, waiting for one tiny memory or one tiny thing to cause them to be triggered, to hit out? What we don't want is children that have gone through grief and the losing of a loved one to suddenly become known as angry and volatile and aggressive and violent. So how do we stop that? By recognizing anger, by validating anger, by you using your own words around, sometimes when I've lost, when I feel the loss of somebody, I do feel anger. It's wrong that they had to die. It's wrong, isn't it? That gives permission for the child to feel angry. And then maybe rip up some paper together, maybe get a punch bag in the garden and start letting them punch away. Maybe they need to just go on a run. Maybe they need to do some star jumps or exercises. They need to get out that feeling of anger rather than push it down. When it's pushed down, it can cause two different things. One is for them to end up being volatile, and that can impact their school life. Or the second is it can lead them to feeling depressed and lethargic because of the heaviness of the weight of anger. So it's really important that we give them time and space to feel angry. Of course, frustration is quite close to anger, isn't it? And very often when children have lost somebody that's loved, then they often feel this huge sense of need to pretend they're fine, but such frustration at the smallest things. They're often needing that extra comfort and reassurance. And so if they try a task at school or they try a task in their activity after school and they're not so good as they were, they can be extra frustrated. They might find that they're either hyper-focused on a task because they just don't want to have the energy or the space to think about their loved one. or they just have no energy to focus at all. And so frustration can come with having different productivity levels as before. They might not achieve as well. They might not be so good at their sport or their writing or reading. They might just not be as good because actually they're all overtaken with trying to manage all these emotions and bodily memories of stress. And then finally, dissociation. Dissociation is a complex topic, but an important one. Because very often, if children look around them in their home and school and they just sense that it's too much, everybody's in grief, everybody's struggling. So I can't bring my grief into this space because nobody really has space for me. What they can learn to do in the subconscious, this isn't a cognitive decision, is to dissociate. And dissociation starts by just sort of staring out the window and looking a bit blank. But actually it can become an internal system where children can either make friends with invisible friends, which are imaginary friends. It could be that they have imaginary friends that they see in their room, or it could be on the inside of them. They could end up with a whole football team or a whole army of people. They could end up with lots of different characters that might have come from TV series or something else like that in a child's world. And they begin to get to know each of those characters and they become absorbed within those. And it's a way of managing, how do I keep going with life and look normal when my insides feel churned up? And I don't want people to pity me, and I don't want people to keep stroking my shoulder and say it's going to be okay. I just want to get on with my life, but I miss that loved one. So they hyper focus into a made up world. When we can recognize that as a trauma symptom, we're able to then begin to help them externalize that world. Because when it stays internalized, it can actually be, it can just escalate into that becomes more real to them than this desk or this camera. And when the internal world becomes more real than the external world, we know that they've had to separate from their day-to-day life in order to survive. Dissociation is brilliant as a short-term coping mechanism. In a funeral, most people do dissociate briefly because they can't quite believe the reality of the death. It's normal to go in and out of denial, but denial is the beginning of dissociation. And at the other end of dissociation is complex and takes a long time to recover from. So the little sign of somebody too much in their own imagination actually is a sign that they need to externalize some of that in a way that's written or drawn and then spoken about, so that they've got more space internally to begin to process the loss of this loved one. Another little sign can be that they're less engaged with friends or activities, that they're more just wanting to hyper focus on that world. Sometimes they do look a little bit lost, a little bit lonely, a little bit like they're not hanging out and giggling with friends like they maybe were, or maybe they never have. Dissociation is an important coping mechanism to recognize. I think that's enough. That's a little whistle-stop tour of a few little symptoms of what children go through when they are processing loss. The first thing of trauma recovery or loss recovery is to recognize what symptoms are normal and to recognize when they become abnormal. So dissociation is normal at the beginning, but it becomes abnormal. It becomes a concerning symptom after a while. Anger is normal for a period of time, but we need to give it an outlet. Otherwise, it can become abnormal and interruptive to the child's development and normal life. Sadness, normal. Let's make space for that over a long period of time. If it was somebody close to them, let's not create cultures where they have to push it down on the inside and pretend they're fine. But equally, if it's long term, then actually that becomes problematic and interruptive to their life as well. So all of these symptoms are very normal reactions to tragic and traumatic loss. But we need to keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't become embedded as normal coping mechanisms for everyday life, but instead are just grief symptoms that can actually be processed, worked through until there is a time where they can live life still with words saying, I'm gutted that that person passed away. I'm devastated they left. I feel robbed that they died. I feel it's so unfair that I'm left without that person in my life. I feel cross and sad and devastated. But I know that they want me to carry on, and I can feel those feelings, and I'm going to press on and make them proud. And that will have more depth to it over time as emotions are held and processed and not pushed away. But let's all agree together to not be nervous and scared of these emotional reactions, but welcome them into our spaces, that they can be felt and heard and validated. I hope that helps. I have lots of books that could be helpful to you. Here's a pile of them. Maybe one of these are on top of this little video to help you understand a little bit more about how children become healthy. Thanks for watching.